Occupational therapist from Clovis has been accused of criminal sexual contact.
Specializes in working with children, lands behind bars after parents notified law enforcement of his bizarre procedures.
In the fabric of every small community, there are threads of trust. We trust our neighbors to watch our homes. We trust our teachers to educate our children. And when our children are sick or struggling, we place our most profound trust in the hands of medical professionals. We invite them into our lives, into our homes, believing they hold the knowledge and compassion to heal. It is a sacred contract, built on faith and vulnerability. But what happens when that contract is not just broken, but shredded? What happens when the healer is a predator? The therapy is a lie, and the trust you offered is used as a weapon against the very child you were trying to protect. In the city of Clovis, New Mexico, several families were about to discover this devastating truth. This is the story of Jared Cordom, a licensed occupational therapist who turned the sanctity of the family home into his personal hunting ground, and the courageous parents who refused to be silenced. Imagine for a moment that you are a parent. Your child, your entire world, is facing challenges, behavioral issues, perhaps, or a physical disability. You would do anything to help them. So when a trusted local pediatrician or your child's daycare center recommends a specialist, a licensed occupational therapist who does in-home visits, you feel a profound sense of relief. Help is on the way. You welcome this man, Jared Cordom, into your home. He's a professional, a man in his late 20s who seems to know what he's doing. You watch the therapy sessions, trying to learn, trying to be supportive. But a feeling of unease begins to creep in. The treatments he performs seem strange. You might even describe them as odd and uncomfortable. In fact, they seem bizarre and sexual in nature. You are witnessing the unthinkable, but your mind struggles to accept it. He's a medical professional. This must be a legitimate, if unusual, form of therapy. But in this case, your gut feeling, that primal parental instinct, is screaming the truth. Because Jared Cordom wasn't a healer. He was a monster, methodically and despicably sexually assaulting vulnerable children, often while their own parents were in the room, watching the abuse unfold. Deceived by his professional charade, this isn't just a story of a predator's crimes. It's the story of how a community's trust was shattered, and how the fight for justice resulted in a sentence that sent a shockwave through the state. 30 years in prison, the absolute legal maximum. The children at the center of this story were living in and around Clovis, New Mexico. They were young boys, many under the age of 13, navigating the already complex world of childhood while also managing behavioral or physical disabilities. Their parents were their fiercest advocates, dedicated to finding them the best possible care. They were, in the words of New Mexico Attorney General Raul Torres,
what I can tell you is that he was using instrumentation and engaged in procedures which are not remotely qualified or called for under the circumstance.
Parents acting in good faith, trying to do the best for their children. In a place like Clovis, the network of care is built on personal recommendations. Trust is paramount. So when local pediatricians and daycare centers, the very pillars of child wellness in the community, referred these families to Jared Cordom, it came with an implicit seal of approval. He was a licensed occupational therapist, a child healthcare professional who specialized in in-home visits for families with children who might find a clinical setting overwhelming. This was presented as an ideal solution. A professional coming to them, providing care in the comfort and security of their own home. This element, the in-home visit, is absolutely critical without understanding the depth of Cordom's betrayal. He wasn't meeting these children in a sterile office with nurses and receptionists just outside the door. He was stepping across the threshold of their family sanctuaries. He was in their living rooms, their bedrooms, their bathrooms. He was embedding himself in the one place on earth a child is supposed to feel completely and unconditionally safe. They opened their doors to Jared Cordom, believing they were giving their sons a chance at a better, healthier life. They couldn't have known that they were inviting a predator into their midst, a man who had already identified the very system of trust they relied on as the perfect tool for his own horrific ends. The New Mexico Department of Justice would later state that Cordom had behaved inappropriately with at least 6 children. The therapy that Jared Cordom provided was a meticulously crafted lie, a series of criminal acts disguised with a thin and cynical veneer of medical legitimacy. What parents first perceived as merely odd or uncomfortable was, in fact, a systematic and escalating pattern of sexual abuse. According to investigators and the criminal charges filed against him, Cordom's process of abuse was methodical. He would instruct his young patients, mostly boys under 13, to remove their clothes, lying to them and their parents that this was a necessary part of the treatment. Once the children were vulnerable, he would touch them inappropriately. This abuse, which led to charges for sexual contact with both clothed and unclothed children, was just the beginning. A forensic expert who later reviewed the case for the prosecution delivered a damning assessment. They officially deemed that Cordom's practices were a flagrant violation of the standard of care for occupational therapy as set by the American Occupational Therapy Association. His supposed treatments were not just unconventional, they were medically unjustifiable and criminal. He directed children to remove their swim trunks during bathing or showering routines. He administered enemas and suppositories to his patients. In a shocking overreach of his professional scope, he used imaging modalities like ultrasounds and electrode analysis, claiming he was diagnosing bowel issues. Let's be perfectly clear, an occupational therapist is not trained, licensed, or authorized to perform these procedures. It would be like a dentist trying to perform heart surgery. It is so far outside the bounds of their profession that it immediately signals a deceptive and ulterior motive. One local pediatrician who had referred patients to Cordom confirmed this, telling investigators they were suspicious of these methods and that, in a major professional red flag, they had never even received Cordom's supposed patient evaluations. The horror of these actions was compounded by the fact that they often happened in plain sight. In several documented incidents, the parents were physically present in the home, sometimes in the same room, witnessing the abuse but unable to process it for what it was, blinded by the trust they had placed in his professional title. But Cordom's depravity extended beyond physical assault. The investigation revealed he was also creating a visual record of his crimes. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of manufacturing child sexual abuse material and 1 count of voyeurism. He wasn't just abusing these children in the moment. He was capturing their violation, turning their trauma into a permanent artifact for his own gratification. This was not a therapist who crossed a line. This was a calculating predator who had built a career around creating opportunities to prey on the most vulnerable among us. The first official thread for investigators to pull came directly from the parents and guardians. Several families took the monumental step of contacting the Clovis Police Department. They bravely reported that the in-home visits felt wrong, that the so-called treatment seemed bizarre and disturbingly sexual in nature. These were the first official voices to challenge Cordom's authority and legitimacy. At the same time, another critical report emerged from a different part of the community's safety net, the school system. A school therapist at a local elementary school became deeply concerned after a conversation with the foster parent of one of Cordom's patients. That foster parent shared a shocking and specific allegation that Cordom had visited their home to treat the child and had inserted something into his rectum. This was not a vague feeling of discomfort. It was a concrete and horrifying claim of sexual abuse that demanded immediate action. The medical community, which had unknowingly enabled Cordom, also began to provide crucial leads. As we mentioned, a local pediatrician grew suspicious, noting Cordom's use of unauthorized diagnostic tools and his failure to file patient evaluations. These professional irregularities added another layer of evidence against him. The Clovis Police Department recognized the gravity and complexity of what they were dealing with. On May 3, 2024, they made the call to bring in the state's top investigators, officially requesting assistance from the New Mexico Department of Justice. In many criminal investigations, detectives get sidetracked by red herrings, false clues, or misleading suspects that waste precious time. But in the Jared Cordom case, the most powerful and insidious red herring wasn't a piece of evidence. It was his entire identity. His status as a licensed healthcare professional was a nearly impenetrable shield, a cloak of legitimacy that deflected suspicion and allowed his abuse to fester right under the noses of caring, attentive parents. This professional facade was his primary tool of manipulation. When parents felt that something was bizarre, their first instinct wasn't to assume criminality. It was to assume their own ignorance. They thought, he's the expert. This must be a new technique. But when his professional mask began to slip, when a parent's intuition became too strong to ignore, Cordom deployed a far more sinister and direct tactic: fear. The sources describe at least one instance that is nothing short of chilling. A mother watching Cordom's interactions with her young son could no longer rationalize what she was seeing. She bravely confronted him about his inappropriate behavior. This was the moment of truth, the point where his scheme should have crumbled. But instead of retreating, Cordom attacked. He weaponized his authority in the most terrifying way imaginable for a parent. He threatened to report her to the state's Children, Youth, and Families Department, or CYFD. Let the gravity of that threat sink in. He was telling this mother, if you expose me, I will use the power of the state to paint you as an unfit parent and try to take your child away from you. It is a tactic of pure evil, designed to silence his accuser by targeting her greatest vulnerability. This threat could have easily become the ultimate red herring, a successful act of intimidation that stopped the investigation cold. But that mother and the other parents found a courage that was stronger than his threats. They did not back down. With the New Mexico Department of Justice now at the helm, the investigation accelerated. Special agents began with meticulous, in-depth interviews of the initial 4 families who had sounded the alarm. Their harrowing, corroborating testimonies formed the bedrock of the state's case. The shared details, the common descriptions of his bizarre methods, created an undeniable pattern of abuse. Based on the strength of these interviews and the supporting evidence, investigators had enough to act. On July 9, 2024, special agents from the NMDOJ descended on Jared Cordom's residence in Clovis and placed him under arrest. he was transported to the Curry County Detention Center, where he has remained incarcerated ever since. But the arrest was not the end of the investigation. It was the key that unlocked the most damning evidence of all. Investigators executed search warrants on Cordom's home, and most critically, on his cell phone. In the digital age, a perpetrator's devices often hold an unvarnished record of their crimes. What they found on Cordom's phone was the irrefutable breakthrough. The warrants uncovered more evidence of child sexual abuse material. This was the digital DNA of his crimes, the visual proof that confirmed the victim's stories and laid bare the true extent of his depravity. This digital evidence had an explosive effect on the case. First, it led investigators to identify even more victims who had suffered in silence. As news of his arrest spread through the community, other courageous families came forward with their own similar stories of abuse. The initial trickle of 4 reports quickly grew, and the scope of his crimes became tragically clearer. The initial charges mushroomed, leading to 2 more criminal cases being filed against him in October 2024. In total, he was facing a barrage of accusations across 3 separate cases, including 10 counts of criminal sexual contact and 3 counts of manufacturing child sexual abuse material. The final piece of the evidentiary puzzle was the forensic expert's testimony. By officially declaring that Cordom's actions violated the standard of care for occupational therapy, the expert dismantled his last possible defense. He could no longer hide behind the pretense of providing treatment. The combination of eyewitness testimony from multiple families, the damning digital evidence from his own phone, and the unequivocal condemnation from a medical expert created a legal case that was airtight. Jared Cordom was cornered by an avalanche of truth. Jared Cordom, the 29-year-old former child healthcare professional, sat in a jail cell facing a future measured in decades. The evidence was overwhelming, the number of charges staggering. The path ahead seemed to lead inevitably to a long and painful trial, a process that would have forced his young victims to relive their trauma on a public stage, cross-examined and questioned. But that trial would never come to pass. In June of 2025, faced with the mountain of irrefutable evidence against him, Jared Cordom accepted a plea deal with prosecutors. He pleaded guilty. Attorney General Raul Torres emphasized the profound significance of this moment, stating that the guilty plea spared these young victims and their families the trauma of testifying in a court trial. It was an admission of guilt that, while serving his own legal interests, provided a small mercy to those he had harmed. The plea agreement consolidated the 3 criminal cases against him. Cordom pleaded guilty to 6 specific felonies that captured the different facets of his abuse. 2 counts of criminal sexual contact of a minor in the 2nd degree for his actions with unclothed children under 13. 2 counts of criminal sexual contact of a minor in the 3rd degree for his actions with clothed children under 13. 1 count of manufacturing visual medium of sexual exploitation of children, a 2nd-degree felony, and 1 count of voyeurism involving a victim under 18. The plea deal stipulated a sentencing range of 20 to 30 years in prison. The final decision would rest with a judge. The final chapter of the legal battle was written before Judge Drew D. Tatum. Cordom's Albuquerque-based attorney, Christopher Marlowe, stated that his client addressed the victims in the courtroom, acknowledging his wrongdoing. But for the prosecution and the families, the day was not about Cordom's remorse. It was about accountability. Attorney General Torres released a powerful statement that cut to the heart of the matter. Today, Jared Cordom is being held accountable for his despicable actions against vulnerable children and their families. Cordom abused his position as a licensed occupational therapist to gain access to these children, and this lengthy prison sentence reflects both the severity of his crimes and the lasting impacts of those violations of trust. Jared Cordom was sentenced to 30 years in prison, the legal maximum for his crimes. It was a sentence that validated the pain of the victims and sent a clear, unambiguous message. The abuse of a child and the violation of professional trust will be met with the full force of the law. But the court's judgment extended far beyond the prison walls. The sentence was designed to protect the public from Jared Cordom for the rest of his natural life. Once he is eventually released, decades from now, he will be placed on indeterminate sex offender probation and parole, putting him under the state's total legal jurisdiction for an incredible 55.5 years. And for as long as he lives, he will be required to register as a sex offender, a permanent mark of his crimes that will follow him everywhere he goes. This sentence represents a legal conclusion, a measure of justice for the families he tore apart. As Attorney General Torres stated, it holds Cordom accountable and prevents him from committing further abuse. But no sentence can fully erase the trauma, the lasting impacts of those violations of trust. The scars he inflicted on these children and their families will remain. The horrifying case of Jared Cordom is a stark and vital lesson. It teaches us that predators do not always lurk in dark alleys. Sometimes they carry clipboards and wear the credentials of people we are conditioned to trust. It also teaches us about the incredible power of parental instinct and the courage it takes to speak up against a figure of authority. If you have an instinct that someone, regardless of their position or the fact that they may be identified as a medical professional, if you think they've engaged in inappropriate behavior, please report that to law enforcement. Trust that instinct. It is one of the most powerful tools you have to protect your children. Ask questions, demand answers, and never, ever be afraid to challenge someone when your child's safety is on the line. Justice has been served for Jared Cordom, but the duty of vigilance belongs to us all. This case is heartbreaking, but it's also a reminder to always trust your instincts and protect our kids at all costs. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please share them in the comments. And if this video resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Together, we can keep these conversations alive and keep our communities safer.